Because the work that we're doing through Mount Moriah is allowing us to support, help, build up, encourage the growing body of Christ in Israel, in the Holy Land. But we are stewards of God's work. We are very much aware that it's not our work, it's the Lord's work. And it says in Isaiah 62:12, all that we have accomplished, you have done for us. And the hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. He says in Isaiah 41. And in 1 Chronicles 29 it says, you are the ruler of all things. Everything comes from you. And we're seeing in Israel now the remnant. Oh no, sorry, tell me we're going to do that one.
Yeah, so as Kathy said earlier, we've been running the Mount Moriah Trust now. It's been going for 16 years, and we've been helping families, young people and pastors in God's land. And many of you have been supporting us and helping in that work, so thank you for that. And what you have been doing has been greatly appreciated in God's land. And as you'll see, one of the original scriptures that the Lord gave to us was comfort, comfort my people. And that's what you, through the Mount Moriah Trust, and us have been doing. And during that time, the Lord has told us to enlarge the work. He continually tells us to enlarge the place of our tent. And every year we've been increasing in size. We started, as you can see there, with just 3 families back in 2001. And today we help 47 different pastors, fellowships and organisations, many hundreds and hundreds of families and children. So thank you for your support, because without your support we could not have done it. We couldn't have increased the amount of support that we send to God's land. And in fact we've got more pastors and congregations lined up to support in the coming 12 months. So we've probably already got something like 51 organisations lined up to help. And every year when we go back to Israel, God leads us to more places and says, I want you to help them. And so that's what we do. We're going to show you tonight some of the pastors. As I said earlier, we've made a new DVD, which is on our website, if you want to look at it. And it's also on YouTube. It's quite long, because we invited 13 different pastors to talk about their congregations, their challenges, how they face them, how they deal with them, and how the Mount Moriah Trust helps them. They're all about 3 or 4 minutes long. We're going to show you just a quick selection tonight. And if you want to watch them, they're on the website, and you can either watch them individually or you can watch the whole DVD right the way through. A bit temperamental. So. And just so that you can see where our support comes from, in the last financial year, which ended at the end of May, 57% of our support came from the UK and 43% came from overseas. You see a large percentage of it comes from Australia, something Rosemary will be familiar with. We've got a very lovely partnership with an organisation called Shalom Israel in Australia, who support our work in a fantastic way. But also we get support from the USA. We've been waiting for the Lord for about 10-15 years now for him to open a door into America. And just when we thought that might happen, he didn't send us west, he sent us east. So we're still waiting for that door. We get a lot of support from Singapore and from Malaysia. And as a result of that, we go out every couple of years to keep people informed as to what's going on and to encourage them as they encourage us through their donations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the situation in Israel today and what's happening in the countries around. I know that was something you were interested in. And Israel today is being described by Amir Safati. Do you know Amir? Any of you? I highly recommend Amir to you. He runs an organisation called Behold Israel. It's well worth subscribing to his website. He is incredibly well informed. He's an ex-IDF major. He was the deputy governor of Jericho some years ago when he was still in the IDF. He is an incredible Bible teacher, and he puts out weekly updates on what's happening in Israel. He is extremely well connected in government. He will tell you things you will never ever hear on the media or through the media. He's extremely well connected militarily, and you can go online and find out what's been happening in Syria. I'll tell you a little bit about it, but he'll tell you about it in detail. So every week he issues an update, and it's well worth listening to. They're anything from half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. But he is an incredibly well-informed Bible teacher. So I recommend him to you. His name is Amir Safati, and his website is called beholdisrael.org. If you want that, I'll give it to you afterwards, you can write it down. I really recommend him to you. So, what's happening in and around Israel at the moment? We'll start with Gaza. Gaza does make the headlines fairly regularly. Every Friday they have this March of Return, what they call the March of Return, where they're trying to persuade people that several million, 5 million people have the right to return to Israel because they were ejected in 1948. That's partly true, but not entirely true. The number that are really entitled to go back, according to UN rules that they apply everywhere else in the world, is about 50,000. But because the UN set up UNRWA, which looks after the Palestinian refugees, in quotes, they've continued that right of going back to the sons, the daughters, the grandchildren, and it just goes on and on. And of course, the majority of those Arabs that left Israel in 1948 were told to go by the Arabs, who told them to get out of the way while they destroyed the Jews, and as soon as they destroyed the Jews, they could all come back. Unfortunately, they lost. So there were undoubtedly some that were pushed out by the Jews. We know that there are some towns and villages that were encouraged to go by the Israelites, the Jews. But not anything like the number that were encouraged to go by the Arabs. It's also worth mentioning that more Jews were expelled from Arab countries in and around Israel at that time than Arabs were expelled from Israel itself, or from the Palestine, as it then was. So every week, you'll probably hear on the news, the Gazans gather at the border. They try and breach the border. That's their objective. Their objective is to try and get through the border, get into some of the Israeli settlements that are close to the border, and kidnap or kill Israelis. That's their major objective. They actually pay people to come and join the demonstrations. I think last Friday there were about 5,000 there. They pay them all an amount. If they get injured, they pay them even more. So they encourage women and children to come. They start bonfires. They start, rioting and what have you. And it's a cover for the extremists to try and breach the border, fire at the IDF, send mortars and things over. And that's happening every week. You will possibly have heard of the incendiary kites and balloons. They've worked out that if they send these balloons up with burning coals hung below them, the wind will take them over into Israel, they'll land, and because the land is so tinder dry, they immediately start fires. And so far they've managed to destroy something like 7,000 or 8,000 acres of land, some of it farming land, some of it wheat fields, some of it nature reserves. So they've killed animals, they've killed bees, there were a lot of beehives down there, they've destroyed those. So it's a very destructive and indiscriminate form of attack. Some of these have also landed in schools, inside towns and things. Luckily they haven't killed anybody or done any serious damage, but many of them have landed in schools and kindergartens, so there's a real threat there. The only way that the Israelis and the IDF have been able to counter that is to set up a system where they monitor them coming in. They try and predict where they're going to land, and then they have firemen waiting for them. So they've managed to minimise the danger. But I think 2 landed last week and set off new fires. So it's a very indiscriminate but a very effective and very cheap way of destroying bits of Israel, destroying livelihoods and so on. Missiles, there have been something like 16,000 missiles now come over from Gaza into Israel. That's missiles, mortars, all that sort of thing. The miracle is that the Lord has deflected those missiles to places where they've done very little damage. There's only been about 5 people killed as a result of that, and the last one was someone who had a heart attack as a result of of a missile landing close to them. So the Lord has been very good to Israel in protecting them, and long may that continue. But they still come over, and even though they don't do any damage, the media tends to concentrate on deaths. You'll hear that there was one IDF soldier injured, 6 Palestinians killed. What that ignores is the upset to lives, the trauma that it causes to people and to children. One night, I think it was the end of August, there were something like 60 missiles fired during the night, and people were constantly going from their beds to the bomb rooms or the shelters, bomb shelters. They get about 45, anywhere between 15 and 45 seconds wherever you are to get from where you are to the shelter. And you can imagine trying to do that with several children, especially if you've got more than 2. Single mums trying to carry 2 or 3 children. And the trauma is really affecting the children. They're having real problems as children. And so the media never talks about those sort of things, but it is really making life for people who live down there very, very difficult, and really affecting their lives. And we don't know for how long that impact is going to be on the children who come through it. So at the moment, Gaza is fairly quiet, apart from Fridays, of course, where they had this rioting and so on. There haven't been many missiles fired recently. There was talk that Egypt was trying to broker a ceasefire agreement. It hasn't got very far. Because what you've got to remember is that Hamas in Gaza is extremely unpopular with the ordinary people. The ordinary people have a very, very miserable life. There's nothing for them there. There's almost no drinkable water. There's very little electricity. It's on and off during the day. Sometimes they get 12 hours, sometimes they don't. So life there is incredibly difficult. They reckon 80% of the people in Gaza are existing on aid. Many of the people haven't been paid. If they're in government jobs, they haven't been paid for months and months and months. So the people are very, very unhappy with Hamas. So in many ways, what Hamas is doing every week is deflecting attention away from the situation for the ordinary people in Gaza. So Gaza is a really terrible place to be at the moment. There are still a few Christians there, not very many. Most of them have left over the last number of years. We still support Gaza Baptist Church, where there are a few born-again believers, and the numbers, as I say, are going down and down.
Sorry, I just got a question. How do they leave? Because some of them can't get out of there.
They can get out by going out round through Egypt and up into Jordan.
Oh, so they've escaped.
Yeah, and many of them obviously are trying to go to America or Europe or wherever they can get out to.
Mm.
A couple of threats from Iran. You probably noticed that the situation on the Syrian border has gone very quiet. The fighting there is finished. President Assad has won. When they were bombing Dara, you will have heard about the thousands of people who left there and went up and sought shelter along the Israeli border. And for years now, Israel has been operating something called Operation Good Neighbour, where they've been helping the Syrians who live along the border there. I just picked up some notes this afternoon. They're going to close the operation down now because it's not necessary. There's peace along there. The Russian military police now patrol the border, and the Russians are trying to get the UN to go back into the no man's land between Syria and Israel. But during the time that the problems have been going on, Israel has helped 7,000 children. They've treated them in hospitals. They treated 4,900 wounded Syrian soldiers, and they provided tons and tons and tons of food, clothing, vehicles, generators, petrol, etc. So they've really been helping the Syrians who live along the border there. Israel is still trying to stop Hezbollah from receiving missiles. Last week, I think it was, they carried out 200 air attacks on sites where Iran was trying to move missiles into Syria in order to give them to Hezbollah for use in Lebanon. They're still trying to get their forces based in Syria, so that they're closer to Israel. Israel is doing everything they can to stop them building bases, but we know that Iranian forces are now embedded strongly in Syrian units. So they're there, but not strictly as Iranian units, but embedded in Syrian units. And of course, as a result of America pulling out of the nuclear agreement, Iran has accelerated the development of their work towards nuclear weapons. They claim it's towards other nuclear uses, but we all know that it's in order to try and get nuclear weapons. So Iran is still a threat, and Israel is doing a lot of things. You'll hear from Amir much more than I can tell you about what Israel is doing to try and combat the threat from Iran. And the threat from Hezbollah. They reckon there's 150,000 missiles in southern Lebanon, that many of them provided by Iran. They're stored with their launchers in civilian sites. Sorry, I'm just about to chip that out. And we know the problems of firing missiles from civilian areas. If they ever do get fired into Israel, Israel will respond. So Israel has, in a way, got on the front foot, because some time ago now, probably 6 months to a year, they actually published all the sites in which Hezbollah had missiles stored, and showed them to be stored in housing areas, under schools, under hospitals, and so on. So they have tried to make it clear what Hezbollah are doing. And as a result of an exercise that Israel had very recently on the northern border with Lebanon, they believe that the Hezbollah are tunnelling in the same way as the Gazans have been tunnelling, and they believe that they're trying to dig tunnels that will come out under the border on the Israel side, so they would be able to attack Israel in a way that it wasn't expecting. I think that Israel is responding by building a wall similar to the one they built or building around Gaza. You know, they've been building a wall which goes 30 metres down into the ground to try and prevent the Gazans from tunnelling into Israel. And I believe that they're going to do a similar thing up on the Lebanese border. So I hope that's been helpful to you. They're not things you'll hear on the news, but as I say, if you want to really understand what's going on, tune in to Amir, because he is excellent at letting you into what's been going on. So I'll hand back to Kathy now, and we'll carry on with the remnant.
Yes, we find that the remnant is coming forth in our lifetime in Israel. And God speaks of the remnant of Israel right through the Bible, in Genesis, from Genesis 45, through the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zephaniah, Zechariah, and others, and through Paul in Romans 9 and 11. As Apostle Paul here in Romans 9 says, though the numbers of the Israelites be like the sand of the sea, only the remnant will be saved. And again he says in Romans 11, at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. And we're finding that this remnant is growing in Israel. Each time we go back, we find there's another fellowship established, more believers coming in, more young people coming to know Yeshua. So it is exciting to see that. And in these last days, Israel is awakening. The veil that is over their eyes is partial and temporary. The veil has a time limit, the times of the Gentiles. And the veil which blinds Jews will be completely, supernaturally be removed by God when the fullness of the Gentiles come in. So we've seen from a handful of believers there were in the 60s, when Ken Burnett, who was our patron, when he was there in 1969, there were about 5 people he knew as believers. But now they've grown to something like 20,000, 25,000 in Israel. No one knows exactly the number, but it's something like that because it is growing. And the interesting thing is that it's prayer that has changed and is changing the spiritual atmosphere in Israel. It is the heavens are opening over Israel, so keep on praying. We are living, as we know, in the end times, and the evidence for that is the next one here. Satan is increasing his attacks on the Jews. The Jews are returning to Israel, they're making Aliyah. The Jews are turning to Yeshua, Jesus. The gospel is being preached to the nations around the world, and there is a rise of messianic expectation in Israel. And the times of the Gentiles are being fulfilled. Maybe they're close to an end. We are living in the end times, and we see the actions of the enemy are increasing through the ultra-Orthodox. But God is also at work in their lives, because some of the ultra-Orthodox have come to know that Yeshua is Messiah. There's only a few, there's not as many as sometimes has been thought, but there are in different yeshivas, there are even rabbis who are coming to know that Jesus is the Messiah. They have a difficult time, they've had to come out of their yeshivas, and they sometimes have to leave their families as believers. But it is a difficult journey that they take, but some do know the truth. So we need to keep praying that more will come to know. David Hathaway, our patron now, since Ken Burnett died, is doing amazing work with Holocaust survivors in Israel. And many are coming to know Jesus through his evangelistic meetings. Especially he works amongst the Russian Holocaust survivors, and many have made commitment now to Jesus, to Yeshua. But Satan is standing in opposition. He knows his time is short, his fury is great, and he wants to get rid of Israel and the Jews. So therefore what we're seeing going on in Israel and the Middle East is satanic oppression. It's all satanic based. It's a spiritual battle, it's spiritual warfare that we're in, and Satan does not want Jesus returning to the Mount of Olives. So if he can destroy Israel, he can destroy Jerusalem, it would become Palestine as he sees it. That's his agenda. So when we look at what's happening with Hamas and with Fatah and all the rest of the terrorists, we know that Satan is the power behind that. So we can pray into that with our spiritual weapons of prayer and standing on the truth of the Bible. We are seeing the branches of the olive tree that have been broken off being grafted in again, from Romans 11, 17 to 24. It's very exciting to see. And one day, all the Jewish branches which have been broken off will be back again into their own natural olive tree alongside the Gentile branches, and the olive tree will be complete. So we just look at this slide, which Jesus spoke about the last, so the last will be first and the first last, in Matthew 20:16. And we can see this, the church, the bride of Christ, the bride of Messiah, that Israel has experienced a hardening in part, and until the full number of the Gentiles come in, from Romans 11, and so all Israel will be saved. That whole remnant will be in. The Jews were in first. They were the first to build the church. They were the church in the beginning. It was only Jews. And then as the Gentiles have come in, they've kind of taken over, and the fullness of the Gentiles is coming round until we're at the end now, and the Jews are the last ones back in. This is what we're seeing. This is the remnant coming in. And so it's a cycle. We're now seeing the Jews first, that are now the last ones in, and then the whole of the bride of Christ will be complete. The whole of that olive tree will be complete. And it's happening in our lifetime. What a privilege to be alive now. So we encourage you to pray and to give as God leads you, because we are seeing God's prophetic destiny of Israel and the nations coming to pass before our eyes. Is that the last one?
So we're in the end times, there's no doubt about that. The end times are close. And if you ever wondered how Ezekiel, the war that was forecast in Ezekiel 38 was going to come about, we're not far from it now. On Israel's northern border, the border with Lebanon and with Syria, you've got Russia, Gog, of Magog, which is part of Russia. They've now got bases in Syria. They've got a naval base, which they were desperate to get because it gives them a warm water base in the winter. Their naval fleet is no longer iced in. They've got a foothold in the Mediterranean. So they have a lot of influence now in Syria. There's Turkey. That's they're also in Syria. They're fighting. There's Iran, Persia in the Bible. They're in Syria, and you've got Iran's proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon. So all the pieces of the jigsaw for the Ezekiel 38 war are there, and that's why go back to what Amir said. This is the calm before the storm. Israel is in many ways extremely prosperous. Their economy is terrific. They are at the forefront of research, medical research, IT research. All the big IT companies have got research centres based in Israel. They're the second biggest arms exporter in the world. They've recently even sold Saudi Arabia the Iron Dome. Saudi Arabia is keen to have protection against Iran, the threat from them. So everything is there, everything is in place for that war to take place. So moving on from cheerful subjects like that, we'd like to just talk to you about the situation in Israel as far as poverty is concerned, because obviously that's very much where we come in. We provide basic humanitarian aid for people. Poverty is still extreme. There's over 2.5 million people living below the poverty line, nearly 1 million children, and 180,000 elderly, including something like 45,000 Holocaust survivors. Things are not getting any easier. The gap between rich and poor is the biggest in the developed world, according to OECD. The rich are getting richer, and sadly the poor are getting poorer. If you've been to Israel regularly, you'll know that the cost of living in Israel is very, very high. We're just about to go out there for 6 weeks, and food and that will cost us more than it does here. Whereas incomes over there, the majority of people don't have great incomes, and even families with 2 or 3 jobs where the wife and the husband are both working, they really struggle. Rents are very, very high, particularly in big cities, ridiculously high, and people are struggling to just get by. Oh, sorry. Jumps, you know. No, I went too far. No, what's it doing? What that slide was showing was that half the people who are living below the poverty line can't afford medicines and things like that, particularly the elderly. So it is a bit of a vicious circle. But what we're going to show you now is some excerpts from the DVD that we had made that highlight some of the issues that the pastors and the congregations have.